Greetings, people from all over this room. Before I move on to the so-called relative clause, before I investigate the contemporary thing called the relative clause, I'd like to do a quick review and bring everybody up to speed. Okay? I've been talking about the word that, which I think is very, very important. And that has 5 grammatical functions in contemporary or traditional use. All right, now if you've seen my previous videos, you'll notice that I've been keeping the grammatical functions, embracing them, but changing the names. In other words, the first grammatical function, I call it that of a definite article. The second one, a pro-form adverb, or you could just say pro-adverb for short if you want to, it doesn't matter. And then I call the third function demonstrative pronoun, which is what they do in contemporary. They do this, they call it the same thing. So anyway, so what we discussed is the word that ordinarily is used in what I call a base form. A base form means it has a one-to-one relationship. In other words, the word that has a one-to-one relationship with another word. And in each particular instance, it performs a single function. For example, base form number 1, all right, function number 1, you have that with a noun. And number 2, as a pro-form adverb, you have that with an adjective. And function number 3, you have that with a noun. And number 5, which we haven't discussed yet, you'll see that, all right, has a one-to-one relationship with a noun clause. Now, grammatical function number 4, all right, is not a base form. It's a different kind of form. But the key thing is, you'll notice in the base form setup, all right, the key thing is you'll notice that the word that comes before the other word. Okay? That comes before the noun or adjective or whatever. And that's the beautiful thing about the base form. All right? So the word that came before. Now, in our quest to find out with grammatical function number 4 if the word is actually really truly a relative pronoun, we notice one thing right away. Okay? We say, is that really a relative pronoun? Well, we notice the first thing is that, the word that, comes after the noun. All right? So it's not a base form. The word that comes after the noun. For example, book that is green, or dress that she wore. Okay, here we have our nouns, book and dress. Now we have our so-called relative clause, all right? You see that? Now in that situation, this is very important before we go into our next videos. The word that in this case, all right, coming after the noun, on its own has no meaning, it has no function, and it's not complete. You can't just say book that, dress that. It's naturally just not complete like that with the word that coming after the noun. It can't stand alone. It needs a verb phrase, or it needs a short clause, a short little dependent clause. It can't stand alone. It needs something. All right? So we know then that it can't be a base form, and we know that it can't be a single function word. I'm trying to make this really, really clear before we move on to investigating the relative clause itself, and before we move on to the new term that I have applied to the word that in grammatical function number 4, okay? Now, the next thing is, the second thing we noticed when we try to determine if that's really a relative pronoun is the word that comes after the noun, all right, but before the subject and or verb phrase, okay? Now let's look at this here again. Book that is green. You see the word that comes after book, but before this verb phrase. It's a meso function. It's in the middle. It's an odd thing. It's in the middle. In grammar, in the world of grammar, it's a peculiar thing. It's in the middle, but you see what happens naturally when this occurs. We have what I call a meta function. We have two things going on here. All right? We have this thing going on here, this relationship that I haven't seen anyone talk about in grammar books, on the internet. I haven't seen anybody discuss this. It's a beautiful thing, I think. So we have what I call a meta form. It's not a base form. It's different. It's a meta form. It almost, in a sense, almost performs a multiple function. In other words, it's not a single function event here. When you use the word that in a so-called relative clause, okay? Meta, the prefix meta means more highly specialized form of, more highly specialized form of, or it means transforming, or it can mean transcending. So you see, I call it a meta function, and like I showed you earlier, all the other functions, the four other grammatical functions of the word that, all right, are in the base form. That comes before the other word. See that there? Now this to me is a very important point. Now, moving along even farther, you see a third feature. All right, the third feature then is, in our investigation to see if it's truly a relative pronoun, if it's truly a pronoun, the word that is a true pronoun, all right, a categorical pronoun, then we end up with the redundant noun or redundant subject. Okay, here's our original sentence. The book that is green is a classic. Okay, the book that is green is a classic. So if that's truly a pronoun, you can put the word book in there, and then you end up with the book is green is a classic. Book. Now the problem here is you don't have the word that to a noun relationship. You don't have that to noun relationship, all right? Right? What you have is book to book, or book equals book. It almost negates itself when you do that. And in this situation here, mentally, when you picture this, when you picture it mentally, it serves no useful function, and it is not grammatically sound. It is not grammatically correct. The book is green. So in the mind, things are going on, and you say, well, I know might be this thing called a relative pronoun, or might be this thing called a relative clause, but what really goes on in the mind? And we're going to talk about that in the next video. Because the fourth feature that jumps out when you ask, is the word that really a relative pronoun? The fourth thing is, you have here what I call, well, if you disregard all the above stuff I just said, just disregard it, post-cognition, after the thinking process happens, after the brain processes what you see, the relative pronoun and the relative clause, after it processes that, all right, the word that vaporizes. It's poof, it's gone. You see, what happens is, in your brain, the book that is green, okay, the book that is green, this is an event-specific phrase or a clause. It's event-specific. You're spontaneously talking, or you've written something and somebody's reading what you've written. It's an event-specific thing. The book that is green. But in the mind, ultimately, the mind will refine or reduce this thought, this lengthy thought, this grammatical piece of stuff, down to what I call basically an archetype. A basic, pure form in the psyche, the purest form of something, or the, as Plato would say, the idea. In other words, this is reduced or refined down to this. Because you say, blah, 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 the book that is green. Well, later on when you're talking about that book, after you've been exposed to the so-called relative clause, your mind just thinks green book, green book, green book. Your mind doesn't every time. It doesn't go, oh, the book that is green, the book that is green. Every time you see or hear the book, it doesn't do that. It's a waste of time and it's stupid. All right? So even if the word that is considered as a true pronoun, which I say it isn't, it will still only be an interim pronoun, okay? It's a pronoun only until the clause is reduced or refined down into the archetype form. You see, it will be only at the very best, at the very most, an interim pronoun, just a pronoun just temporarily pronominal until it's processed completely. Because I have all these different books over here, and I look at my books and I'll say, oh, that's the book that is, well, that's the book that is, and that's the book that is. It's just a book, 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 and that's how it goes. Anyway, so I'm going to move on to an investigation of the so-called relative clause and explain why I don't consider the word that a relative pronoun and why I don't even think there is a relative clause. I think there's so much more here than meets the ear. Anyway, hey, thanks for being incredibly patient, and we hope to see you soon. Good night.